Well, hi, everybody. My name's Leslie Pielack. I'm the museum director at the Birmingham Museum, and we're presenting in person and on Zoom a program that we first did 3 years ago. And it was very popular, and we thought this is the time of year to really look at this crime scene again. In 1825, there was a double homicide here in Birmingham, and the event and the people involved are still very fascinating. And so what we'd like to do is present the information, and with me tonight, and I'll introduce him in a second, is Commander Scott Grewe of the Birmingham Police Department, who, like 3 years ago when we presented this program, brought his perspective from modern police work and his background in investigation and so forth to sort of apply to some of these historic events. And with the audience, we all discussed some of the theories and some of the ways that we could look at this crime and try to understand it better. And I'm not saying we came to any firm conclusions, but tonight the chat is available for those of you on Zoom. And we do have in-person participants also. So as we go through the detail, we're going to open it up and invite comments at any point. For those of you who want to participate by chat, we have a member of the library staff, Jen, who will be moderating the chat comments and questions. So we might, need a little time to get that straightened out, but please make sure that if you have a question, you include it. Okay, so as I said, my name is Leslie Pielack. I'm from the Birmingham Museum. The museum is interested in all aspects of Birmingham's history, but especially people. And so this story is all about a lot of interesting people. And I want to introduce right now, he's going to step over to the podium where the camera will pick him up. I'm going to introduce Commander Scott Grewe, who can tell you a little bit about himself and why he's here.
Hello, good evening, everybody. Again, Commander Scott Grewe, like Leslie mentioned, I've been with the police department now for almost 23 years. During my time there, I've been involved in pretty much every aspect of the police department, from training new officers to investigations to now my position as operations commander, overseeing all the operations of the police department. So as Leslie mentioned, 3 years ago, we did this presentation here at the library, and it was very interesting. So I definitely encourage everybody here to ask questions, because we had a great conversation last time. A lot of different ideas and thoughts and opinions were brought up, which created a very nice discussion. So happy to be here. And if you have any questions, please definitely forward those on so we can continue the discussion. Thank you.
Well, so we haven't done it this way before. I've never co-presented with the Zoom where somebody had to come in and out of the camera like this, but hopefully when it's time for Scott to make a comment, he will step over and I'll get out of his way. But what I want to do first is present the information that we do know, and I have a slideshow to do that. So I want to start with sort of what I would call kind of set the scene. And I mean that in a historic sense. We're talking about what events had been going on in the world at large, especially in the US, that might have had some kind of impact or influence on what happened in 1825. There's a little bit to go through there. So if you follow along with my slides, you can kind of get a sense of that. It's not advancing. Okay, let's try this. Okay, probably the biggest factor influencing the people who were here in 1825 that were affected by this event was the War of 1812. A couple of important things to keep in mind that may have played a part is that most of the settlers who were just coming up the Saginaw Trail, which is the same thing as Woodward Avenue today, were veterans of the War of 1812. They had served various capacities, and they were coming to Michigan because there was an incentive to buy land here, which had just been acquired from the native peoples and was being sold at public auction, just like in 1818. So just within a couple of years, these settlers had come up the trail, purchased land, and built log cabins here and there. This was a settlement, but it didn't even have a name yet. It wasn't called Birmingham for quite a number of years yet. Now, the important thing to keep in mind about the environment and the native people is that there were still many indigenous people moving along the trail in 1825, and they still occupied and used the lands for hunting. And in general, there were not very many problems with them, but people were very afraid, partly because the British during the war had brought Native people onto their side, especially the Saginaw Chippewa, and had actively encouraged them to kill Americans. And partly because of cultural reasons, that often meant, pretty awful slaughter and maiming. And there was a lot of hand combat during the war. And you can see some of these photos depict the use of hand weapons, especially what was easy to at hand, such as hand hatchets, knives, etc. Scalping was done by both the Americans and the British, as well as the Native people. So there was a lot of blood and a lot of direct contact with people during the war in conflict. So the British really played this up because they wanted to scare the daylights out of as many Americans as they could, and it was very effective. So they played up the terrorist aspect of the Native people here. Well, Americans also were responsible for their share of atrocities. So this particular etching depicts one massacre that Americans perpetrated on a small group of very peaceable Native people and their families and children. So it went both ways, is my point. There was a lot of this going on. So a little bit closer in, then, if we're looking at the 1825 Oakland County wilderness, this is the sort of thing that you would have seen along the Saginaw Trail. You'd have seen stumps where some of the large virgin forest had been cut and wasn't even completely cleared yet, and used to build log cabins such as these. Those were the first dwellings that people could build. So this was very remote and very rustic. Okay, so bringing the timeline forward a little bit. So the War of 1812 lasted from 1812 to 1815. There was a lot of fierce fighting around the Great Lakes area. And two men who later came to the area, Elijah and Emery Fish, both served in militia regiments from New York, but they, I think they fought all over. And when they migrated to Michigan, Elijah came with his family first, and Emery followed him later on. The war ended in February of 1815, and a lot of the militia, basically, if they were already over here, a lot of times they just stayed. If they were not connected, or if they thought they wanted to get involved in some of the land purchasing, they would send back home for their families who would join them later. Elijah Fish, in fact, came with his wife and two young sons in April of 1820 and bought land along what is now Woodward Avenue at approximately Corton. And then in 1823 and 24, another settling family, John and Polly Diamond Utter. So Polly Diamond, that was her maiden name. She and her husband, John Utter, came here probably because her brother also had come here, and he owned property further up the Saginaw Trail closer to Pontiac. The Utters they're at the center of this story. They were tenant farmers. The typical process, if someone didn't have a lot of money but wanted to settle in the wilderness, is that they would come and they would work someone else's land. They would clear it, They put up a cabin and they would earn funds so that they could buy their own parcel. So that was very common at this time. And John and Polly Utter and their 2 children, lived as tenants on in one of these small cabins. So then Imre Fish, who is the brother of Elijah Fish, who is also at the center of the story, came in 1823 or 24. He didn't come with his brother. He followed his brother a couple of years later. He was a single man. He was a veteran of the war, and he had kind of some interesting past that was recorded after the murders. This information was recorded, and that's where it comes from, that he had apparently some kind of what were called fits since childhood, and was at times deranged for the 9 years prior to 1825. Now, what that suggests is that from about the time of 1816, right after the war, he had some kind of periods where he was in a deranged state of mind, but that he had some kind of episodes since he was a child. So this is a map that kind of shows you where the main settlers were. The dotted blue line is the Saginaw Trail. And so, like I said, it roughly parallels Woodward Avenue, or is the same as Woodward Avenue. And the red squares represent the large section holdings. And then the black names are the people who bought the property or owned it by the point of 1825. But that doesn't mean that's all of the people who were here, because like I just said, there were people who were tenant farmers who were, kind of renting, you could say, and they wouldn't show up as a landowner. So there's a scale of miles that I put on here for reference. You can see that most of these settlers are within a fairly short distance of each other in the sense of maybe they're a half mile apart. I also thought you might want to know, how does this relate to downtown Birmingham? So I included that on the map. Oops, that went twice. All right, this is advancing instead of, sorry about that. I'm going to use the back button and see if that works better. Okay. All right, so here's another detail of the same map, just showing where the Utters seem to have been. We don't know exactly. There were 2 different possible locations, but going by, there was a surveyor who lived in the area who described it approximately here. And you can see just about a quarter mile up the trail is E. Fish. That red dot there is Fish's cabin location. And to the south, you see another red square, and that's where Zybaswan's cabin was. And then if you go yet another quarter mile, you see Willits, Hamilton, and Hunter, and that's downtown Birmingham. It's always good, and historians like us at the museum, we're always trying to narrow down our sources. Who said what? Where does this come from? Is this a story that's handed down in a family? That's one source of information. But it's important that we try to use primary sources, something that was recorded at the time. And so this is the list of information that our details and facts coming up are drawn from. Most important is the county inquisition record. And the dates mentioned there. There are grand jury proceedings later on that also recorded different things, some more Oakland County records, and 2 articles that were published, one on April 8th and one on April 12th of 1825 in the Detroit Gazette, which was the only newspaper around. And they reported on this event, and they included some details that didn't come up in the hearing. There also were reminiscences that were published much, much later. In 1881, Nancy Davis, who was the daughter of one of the settlers, her account of what happened as she remembered it then was recorded. So this is almost 60 years later. So as you know, when people are remembering things from 60 years ago, they could be remembering very accurately, or they could be remembering things that have been blended with other ideas over time. So it's important information, but we don't want to really rely on it directly. So the next slide here shows a more specific timeline. Okay, now we're getting close to the actual crime. If you have missed out on what the crime was, we are talking about a double homicide, axe murders of Polly Utter and her daughter Cynthia Utter by Emery Fish. So this timeline is composed of the different witness testimony and what they said happened first, second, and third. So on Saturday, April 2nd, this is 2 days before the murders, between 9 and 10 o'clock at night, Emery Fish, who was boarding at the Utter's cabin as a boarder, he went away from the Utter cabin, just went away at night. Okay, we would do that now. We'd get in our car and drive to the store or something. But on the Saginaw Trail in the wilderness, there are bears and wolves and it's dark. So this was considered a very odd behavior, and rightly so. The next morning, he hadn't shown up. So his brother, again, who was about a half mile up the trail, was informed, that he had left, and, no one knew what his whereabouts were. And so they began to look on the trail for Emery. About 1 mile south of the Utter's cabin, that would have been approximately between Swans and downtown Birmingham, they found his clothes strewn on the trail. A little bit later, he was found himself on the trail completely naked, about 5 miles further south, which is approximately where Royal Oak is. So he had left at night in springtime. It was April. He had removed his clothes just a mile south. It was probably cold out. And these are things just to keep in mind what his state of mind might have been like. And he continued moving south on the trail without clothes for another 4 miles, all night long. Emery was brought by his brother back to Elijah Fish's house. And Elijah, remember, he had a wife and 2 children at home. And so Emery was brought in, and he was, warmed up and given something to eat. And he, over that night, seemed to recover. This is what was reported. So now it's Monday morning. Later on Monday at around sundown, and I looked up what time sundown would have been on Monday, April 4th. They didn't have daylight savings time. It would have been about 6:28 p.m., just for your reference. Certain other events occurred. So towards night, it was reported, Emery again left Elijah's, his brother, where he had been recovering, exhibiting unusual signs of derangement. And he went to the Utter cabin and took from his chest letters and other papers. And then he walked in the woods, meaning, just took off into the woods. Someone went and notified Elijah that his brother was again having a lot of problems. And Elijah started looking for him along the trail again. And as Elijah had turned around and was heading back home, he heard shrieks of distress from the Utter cabin nearby and ran to the spot about 30 or 40 rods away, which is approximately 200 yards, and found Polly Utter, Mrs. Utter, lifeless on the ground near the door of the Utter cabin. So I have a question, that I thought of, so was it still light then? Is that how he knew who it was? I'm assuming there was some way to tell who it was. And he must have been able to see something because he immediately ran in the direction in which he had previously seen someone running. So he had to be able to see that there was a figure ahead. And so he ran in that direction. And he had not gone many rods, maybe 20 or 30 yards, hard to say what that means, when he encountered his brother Imre holding an axe. And Imre raised the axe immediately and stated, "You want killing too." And he ran after Elijah. Elijah escaped to his neighbors named Hunt, who was apparently another tenant farmer at the time, and gave the alarm. So these events are being reported by the Detroit Gazette, and they went on to say Imre was captured with some difficulty and bound, and he was later imprisoned in the log jail in Pontiac above Sheriff Sidney Dole's abode. Polly Utter, age 44, was found with her head nearly severed from her body. Cynthia Utter, age 13, was found about 20 rods, or about 100 yards, from the house, killed by a deep wound extending obliquely from her mouth across her neck, with other wounds. And the report said Imre acknowledged that he had killed them and said he thought it was his duty to do so. And this is an example of the printed article that that information was taken from. So John Utter also had a report in a later article. They quoted what John Utter said happened. He said that he returned home. He had been gone. His wife and daughter were still at home. He had been gone apparently with his son, and that they returned home between 7 and 8 in the evening to an empty house. And they called for the wife and daughter and looked around for them and couldn't find them. So thinking something wasn't right, they went to a neighbor's who turned out to be Zybaswan, who returned with John to search. And after some time, they stumbled over a body lying in a footpath. It was his daughter, who had several axe wounds in her head and other parts of her body. So John Utter and his neighbor, Zybaswan, went back to look around the house and found her, meaning Polly's, mangled remains near the woodpile a few yards from the house. The next morning, per the Gazette, Elijah's horse was found mortally wounded, which Imre later confessed that he did with the axe. The night that the bodies were discovered, a county inquisition was immediately called, and that's pretty significant because they had to bring all these people in the evening of the murders and hold this inquisition. So these are the facts that came from the report that night. First of all, it was the first criminal investigation in the newly formed Oakland County. This was the wilderness, and there weren't courts operating in any kind of normal sense yet, exactly. The members of the Inquisition included the local landowners. That was how things were done. And so the whole list of them is on the slide here. And the Oakland County coroner was present, whose name was David Perrin. So there was a coroner in attendance. And the testimony was provided by Zybaswan and Elijah Fish. So I'm going to go through their testimony next. Zybaswan said that on April 4th, the evening, that was Monday, he was called to go to the house of Imre Fish. When he arrived, he met with Mr. Utter at the entrance of the barn. They proceeded to the house together and found no one there except a child on the bed. Now, this would have been Mary Ann Utter, who was about 3.5 years old at the time. Mr. Utter took the child up and they started to go back to Elijah Fish's. But when they were trying to leave, when they came to the barn, Imre Fish was sitting on the bars of the barn, either gate or fence, with an axe in his hands. And so Zybaswan, who was also a surgeon in the War of 1812, and so had some medical training, asked who was here, and Fish said, "It is I." And Swan said that Fish raised his axe, so Swan grasped it by the shaft and pulled Fish off the bars with the axe handle. And then John Utter helped Swan get the axe out of Fish's hands, and then they bound him. On going to the house again, they then found Mrs. Utter lying dead not far from the door. Oops, sorry about that. All right, I'm having problems again. This is an example of what the document looks like that recorded these events. It's longhand plus. So this is a really interesting thing to transcribe, and not every single word can always be read, but with some effort, you can pretty much work it out. I just thought you might like to see what it looked like. So Fish's testimony at the same inquisition was that upon arrival at the scene, he found a body, which he was supposing to be his brother Emery, but discovering it was not, he then found that it was Mrs. Utter. And that on looking over the field, he saw a glimpse of some person. He approached it and met Emery with an axe. Emery drew the axe and said, "I believe you want killing too." And then Elijah started to go to Hunt's. Again, that's one of the neighbors nearby. And Emery followed him with the axe. So Elijah escaped him and he went on to Hunt's. And then came back to the fish cabin. I'm sorry, on his return to the fish cabin, he saw Emery near his barn. So now he's at his home. And he ran in the house and told the family to go to Hunt's, get out of the house. Then he went out to meet Emery, and Emery still had the axe at that time. He went as near as he thought safe and jumped over the fence so that he was able to turn Emery around away from looking at the house while the family got away. And then Emery left and went back to the Utter cabin. So that's the testimony at the Inquisition. And so I'm just inserting here a little bit about axes at the time. What did people use in the 19th century? When they were talking about an axe, what did they mean? Well, they could have meant any of these three types of axe. The first one is a felling axe. That's the sort of axe that you needed to cut down trees, cut down logs, and in a certain sense to do some wood splitting for burning purposes. The second is a hand axe, and those would be used for all kinds of small jobs around, your woodlot. And then the bottom is a broad axe, and so those are also used for heavy work. So now moving on a little further, the timeline after the incarceration, while everything was waiting for the trial, went something like this. On April 4th, Emery was subdued and bound by Zybaswan and John Utter. He confessed to the murders that night, and he was imprisoned in Oakland County's jail. And the jail had the sheriff living below, and they had quarters up above, and that's where he would have been imprisoned. And it was in Pontiac, which was the local town at the time. On May 7th, Elijah Fish was appointed guardian of Emery Fish with control of his estate, and he was responsible for the payment for Emery's care. Now, a whole year later, June 19 and 20 of 1826, is when the court actually heard this case, when it came to formal trial. The sheriff at the time was William Morris, which is a neighbor, and the judge was John Hunt. The grand jury assembled, made up of local property owners, similar to the Inquisition, and neighbors. And Emery Fish received 2 indictments for the murders of Polly Utter and Cynthia Ann Utter. And as the court concluded, the charge for Polly's murder had been dismissed, and he was found not guilty for Cynthia Ann, but charged with insanity, and he remained incarcerated. So it's I'm not a legal expert or a legal historian, but in essence, it was like not guilty by reason of insanity, like we would think of today. So here are the words from the actual indictment on June 20 of 1826, that Imre Fish, late of the town of Bloomfield, not having the fear of God before his eyes, but being moved and deceived by the motivation of the devil on the 4th day of April, 1825, with force and arms at the town aforesaid, feloniously, willfully, and of his malice aforethought, did make an assault and held the said Cynthia Utter in and upon the right side of the head and neck, below the right ear of her. Then and there did strike, cut, penetrate, and wound, giving to Cynthia Utter upon the right side of the head and neck, below the right ear, one mortal wound of the breadth of 8 inches and of the depth of 4 inches, of which said mortal wound she there and then instantly died. This is what a log jail would have looked like, similar to the one that was probably in Pontiac. Before we go into the actual murders, I want to also mention the community impact, and then we're going to stop, and then I'm going to invite Commander Gruye to say a few words about this. So while there was a time lag between the alarm of the murders and his apprehension, there was a sense of panic in the homesteads that had heard something about this that night. One neighbor reportedly almost shot another one in the dark, thinking him the murderer. Mrs. Fish and Mrs. Bagley later went to the Utter cabin to clean and prepare the bodies. And other local women pieced together cambric to make shrouds because there was no other source of to make funeral shrouds, which was the way funerals were handled then. So they had to actually piece cloth together to have enough. And John Utter reportedly died 2 years later of grief. That's how it was reported. Another impact is that Greenwood Cemetery in Birmingham was founded because Dr. Swan donated a portion of his land so that the Utter women could be properly buried. And that is the foundation of Greenwood Cemetery today. At the time, just to comment that public cemeteries really didn't normally exist. That they were not a thing yet. Normally you'd be buried in the churchyard or sometimes on, the property. Another comment I had made is that Dr. Swan had served as a field surgeon during the War of 1812. And according to oral tradition, he donated the land for the cemetery because he felt responsible, because he apparently had recommended Imre as a boarder to the Utters in the first place. So let's see where this goes. Next. Okay, so I'd like to invite Commander Gruye to give my voice a rest and exercise his own and say a few words about this.
Okay, well, I think one thing I just want to mention or bring up first of all is that in today in modern policing, what we would do is attempt to establish a timeline and really figure out how all this stuff occurred, where it started, what happened first, and like I said, that timeline of where it went. So when we look at this case and go over what Leslie had described to us, one thing I found interesting is the Elijah, when he was heading back towards his cabin after looking for Imre the second time around, mentioned hearing these shrieks by the Utter's cabin and went back to the cabin, and that's when he found Polly. Later, it's noted that his own horse was mutilated and killed at his property, which is about 3/4 of a mile north from where the Utter's cabin was. So it's kind of an interesting timeline if that happened first, if he mutilated the horse there first, or if there was an incident with Polly first, or how that all happened. There was some time, obviously, when Elijah did lure him away, and they lost sight of him until he was later bound by Swan and Mr. Utter. where he was at the barn on the fence that was described. So it could have happened at that time. The other thing that we were discussing the last time around too was, what happened first. Like I said, I mentioned with the horse or Polly, but also with Polly and her daughter. Polly was found near the front of the cabin, also described near a wood pile, which, we could all assume in that era, it would have been very close to the front door of the house as a way to means the heat for the house. So is that where he obtained the axe that they used or the hatchet, most likely something a little bit smaller, easy to carry and swing, that maybe was located at that wood pile that they were using at the house? And did something happen with Polly, potentially? And the shrieking was the daughter who then ran, because she was found a distance away from the home, and maybe he ran after her. So, we kind of discuss those things as options as far as what happened or what was the timeline of events and how all this stuff occurred. So I think probably the best thing we can do right now maybe is if people have any questions, if there's anything from our Zoom audience here, if you have anything you'd like to ask or any comments or suggestions you have, we can definitely go over that. And if anybody in the room here has any questions or comments or thoughts, opinions on how this all occurred, I think that'd be interesting. The other thing I wanted to mention too is right now in the police world, mental health is a huge topic. Here in the Birmingham Police Department, we started a core program. It's a core response program due to the mental health crisis and making sure that we're responding to mental health scenes appropriately. Obviously, in this case here, there were signs of Emery having mental health issues as a child. And as you can imagine, back in 1825, there wasn't a whole lot out there for anybody with mental health or treatment or anything to do with them. Also interesting, I note is that Mr. Swan recommended Emery to the Utters to be this tenant farmer, with not much comment in anywhere that we saw as far as what his brother Elijah said. So I find that interesting as well, that he was recommended to this family from someone who was a doctor, obviously a surgeon, no, not a mental health specialist, to a family with 3 children at home. So, in today's world, obviously that's something we take very serious and have programs to help out with mental health. And back then that was kind of unforeseen thing. The other thing that I also found interesting is that he was found the day before, with all his clothes off, miles away from the house. So when we look at a situation like that now, this was early April. This is, I believe it was at 7 or 8 o'clock at night when he was found. It's pretty cold. Is that an issue of a mental health breakdown potentially? Is that an issue with the weather, where he's drawing a blank here on the word I'm looking for, experiencing
like PTSD?
Not PTSD. Anyways, I'm sorry. But when people are out in the cold and their temperature in their body starts to drop. Hypothermia, thank you. I don't know why I couldn't get that word out. When they start to experience hypothermia, one of the first things they do, one of the first signs is they actually take their clothes off. Their mind tricks them and thinks they're warm. And a lot of hypothermia victims that we find are naked, unfortunately, because they think they're hot and their mind tricks them to do that. So, this is early April. Is that potentially an issue where he was experiencing hypothermia, and that's why he was, had removed all his clothes? The other thing that we also talk about in the law enforcement community is what we call excited delirium. Excited delirium is a situation where a person's heart rate and blood pressure gets so high that typically when we find them, they'll be naked because they strip themselves of their clothes because of the extreme heat from their body, and they're sweating profusely and typically acting in a deranged state. That's usually a combination of possibly some mental health issues as well as like a narcotic use that goes along with that. I don't know if maybe that's a possibility of what he was experiencing that night. But those are the two things in today's world that when we see somebody that is acting deranged or, have removed all their clothing, those are the first two things that come to mind for us in today's world. So I just wanted to mention that to everybody as well. So
do you have any comments about the idea of PTSD being a factor? Do you have any thoughts about that?
Yeah, so PTSD, again, back in 1825, nobody knew what PTSD was. Obviously, that's a serious concern now. The hatchet and what he did to the victims here are very much just what was described by Leslie early on as far as the warfare that he would have saw and things he would have been struggling with at the time. So, I think there's a very good chance that the PTSD was a big part of what he was dealing with and experiencing. I think you combine that with the obvious mental health issues that were identified as a child with his acts of fits or deranged periods. And you add in being in a war like 1812 and the type of tactics that were used. I mean, PTSD and obviously what he did here with a hatchet is probably very likely what caused this incident here.
You have one question from the chat.
Okay, we have a question from the chat room.
Yeah.
Can they hear you through?
I don't think so. So you might have.
I'll just repeat it when you, yeah.
So it seems as though there was no standard way of spelling Imre. Do we know if he was literate and how he would have spelled his name? I want to see that.
Hi, yeah, actually the spelling issue, it was spelled E-M-R-I and I-M-R-I. We don't have any information about him being literate exactly, but if we go by what was reported, he went to the udders to his chest and got out some of his papers, whatever that is. What are those papers? I don't know. Were they military papers? Did they have to do with his discharge or pension? Were they letters? We don't know. But it sounds to me like he was able to read. But you have to also probably keep in mind that when people were recording, and a lot of times things were spelled phonetically, but based on the best way they could spell. So even court recorders would spell I's like E-A-Y-E-S. So I think that's kind of a universal thing, at least out in the wilderness at that time, that people spelled in different ways. I don't know if that answers your question, but I'm going to guess that he was literate. I know his brother Elijah Fish was literate, and so we could perhaps, go on that. I have a question too. Commander Gruye, I was reading through the detail again on the indictment, and I guess I can go back to it. Why don't I do that? Right here. So in the middle paragraph here, it makes it sound like maybe the coroner was able to determine that first he seemed to hold Cynthia down around the face and then strike her. So it sounds like they're saying there were two steps here. Do you think that makes any sense, or am I misreading that?
That's a great question. I'm looking at the paragraph now that you're saying it, and it states that and held the said Cynthia and Utter in and upon the right side. So that may be just a way that they documented that as far as the strike. Based on the wound as described in here, I would doubt that he had a hold of her at the time. It talks about 8 inches in length and 4 inches in depth of a wound. So that's a pretty good swing of an axe to hit somebody. I think it would be difficult if you're trying to hold that person, especially with the wound being up around the face. So I'm going to guess that that's probably just the way they stated it, and that he maybe wasn't exactly holding on to her and striking her at the same time. However, I would assume that there may have been some type of assault that took place that led up to the strike of the axe.
But based on the nature of the wound, the way they describe it, you're imagining that he would have had to be, swinging back and hitting with some force. So he couldn't be too close. He have to have a little bit of distance to do that.
Correct. I mean, with that type of wound, I'm going to assume that, again, yes, like you described, he's swinging this axe. This isn't something where he's in close contact, holding on to somebody. It's a little bit harder to swing a weapon when you're that close to somebody, when you're engaged in a physical confrontation with them. If you're more at arm's length, you have room to swing that axe. So I'm going to guess that they may have been, again, in some type of physical confrontation, but there was some separation where he was able to swing that to create that type of wound. If they were, tussling with one another, you would see more of maybe like a stabbing movement or a close punch, something like that. But the 8 inches in width is the one that, to me, is like a slicing, swinging motion. Most of those axe blades are probably no more than 4 inches in length themselves. So this is more of a slicing, swinging type motion, I would assume, from this type of a wound.
There's a comment. Oh, no, you got it.
Yes.
It states that it sounds like both the Polly and Cynthia were outside. They said something about Polly was found near the door.
Correct.
Within the front. So was it because they happened to be outside and he had the axe? Doesn't sound like they were inside and they were brought outside. So was it like a circumstance that they just happened to be outside and he was deranged and saw them and attacked them?
That very well can be the case. I'm going to assume again, like I mentioned earlier, that potentially this axe was by the wood pile for splitting wood for heating the home. And maybe there was some confrontation between the two of them that started this incident. Maybe it was lingering over from being deranged and the issue he was dealing with the day before, where he was found naked and wandering. And maybe he was just in one of his deranged fits. And when he saw her, combination like Leslie said, as far as a PTSD, and maybe he was having flashbacks of the war, and thought he was under attack and attacked who he saw. And kind of like what I said was, was the shrieking, was that the daughter seeing Polly get struck, or was that Polly seeing the daughter get struck and maybe he chased her back towards the house? Maybe she was running to the house for protection. He chased her back that way. I mean, obviously one of the two happened first, and someone shrieked, so someone was able to do that. With the wounds described here, I don't know that that person would be shrieking. That sounds like a pretty mortal wound there. So I'm thinking it's going to be from the other person that saw that and then maybe ran and he gave chase. There was another comment back here.
Yes, when you asked if they happened to be outside, it could be they were inside and saw him and were trying to escape, and he was able to overpower them.
Yeah, that's very possible. It was known, I'm sure they would have known about the incident the day prior. They're the ones that reported that he had left, so that maybe he returned. And when he returned, they tried to escape because of the deranged fit he was having the day before. So out of concern, maybe they were trying to flee. That's very possible, sure.
It does bring up the question of the child. The child was found in the cabin after John and Zyba came back some time later. So whether the child had been outside and then came into the cabin after the event or was in the cabin the whole time, I guess I would say, I can't imagine a mother running away and leaving a little child. I could see a mother running to the child, in some way, but it doesn't seem like she would leave if the child was in the cabin.
Unless she was trying to get help and she could not get to the child in time, but thought she could get to her neighbors
It's possible.
and protect that child.
Yeah, I mean, that's possible. Maybe,
So for anybody on Zoom here, just the conversation that's going on in the room was the comment that maybe they were in the home and they were fleeing the home because Emery had made entry or returned to the house. And then the concern was with a 3.5-year-old that was found in the house after they were found killed outside, would a typical mother flee the house and leave their 3.5-year-old alone inside? And debating on whether or not that would be a probable course of action or not. I guess that kind of also brings into question then if they were outside and on some field or down some trail where the daughter was found killed, how far away from the home would they have been leaving that 3.5-year-old there? So I think putting all those things together, it's almost more likely that Polly was probably killed outside the cabin first. And maybe the one daughter saw that. She's the shrieks that Elijah Fish hears, and then she runs and possibly Emery gives chase and then kills her. Again, with a 3.5-year-old inside, most mothers are not going to, leave that child there alone. So it kind of gives different thoughts into potentially how these occurred.
Whatever happened to the younger daughter? Because it stated that the father passed 2 years after.
I have a few slides about that.
Oh, okay.
Yep.
I'm glad you asked that.
There's one more comment. This is more just a comment. Someone said that the indictment describes demonic possession as the motivation of the murder. So just as a comment as to why, other than being insane, that he, that's kind of insane. But anyways, but why his motivation to kill Polly and Cynthia? It says demonic possession. So.
Correct. And basically, I think if I remember right, it said that he did not have the fear of God and the devil in him or something like that was what was referenced in talking about his deranged states. So, did you want to go through those other?
Yeah, and I just want to add one more quick comment from the history of mental health sort of issue. It was not uncommon for people to think in moral terms at the time. that why would someone do something horrific? The only real explanation is that, Satan made them do it. That's not exactly the demonic possession you'd be thinking of that would reflect something more current or contemporary when we talk about that. It's really more an attempt to explain this horrific event in terms that could be understood by the average person. So I wouldn't read too much beyond that in it, except just thinking, how do you explain this? Well, you say that, the devil made him do it, kind of thing. All right, so let me show you a few more slides here, because the question has come up here in the audience. What happened to the little girl? So I'm going to advance forward my slides. I should probably at least explain before I get to that. The Utters have these memorials at Greenwood Cemetery. And if you live in Birmingham or visit Birmingham and you go to Greenwood, the Utters are in the oldest part of the cemetery because they were the first burials there. And that is right near the east entrance on Oak Street. You can walk in and you can see Polly and Cynthia's marker is actually misspelled. I think it was installed quite a bit later and they forgot the I. Her name was Cynthia, not Cyntha. Okay, so here's the epilogue. So first, Elijah Fish, his brother has committed this horrific act and he's a settler and a prominent man. What happens to him? Well, he continues to pay Emery's expenses until 1830 when Emery dies. And he dies in jail at the Oakland County Jail. We don't have any idea where he was buried, if at all. Also, Elijah became a deacon of the First Presbyterian Church. So he founded the Presbyterian Church, which met for the first time in his barn on his property about 9 years after the murder. So whether he became involved in the church as a result of this or whether, that was always his leaning, it's hard to say. His home was a wooden house that he had built to replace the cabin around 1834. And then in 1836, they added a large brick component to it. And this is the house. It used to stand on Woodward Avenue, and it was later on called the Benedict House. And so if you are familiar with Woodward and a long, long time ago, you may remember this house used to be on Woodward. Further up, like I said, between Quarton and Lone Pine. Another thing that Elijah Fish is known for is that he became a very important local figure in the anti-slavery movement. In fact, we just recently learned, one of the museum staff down at Casaselli, it's just found all kinds of documents proving that he was also connected to the Underground Railroad in Michigan and helped people on the Underground Railroad get to Canada. So that's a little bit about Elijah Fish. Now the children. So Joseph Utter isn't mentioned a lot in the actual event, but he was the teenage son who was with his father, John, when they left the Utter farm to go do whatever they went to do. How much he directly experienced is not recorded. But from 1825 until 1826, he was 15, and his little sister that survived, 3.5-year-old Marianne, they were cared for by a neighbor, Mr. and Mrs. George Morris, until their father John died in 1826. So it sounds like the father John was unable to care for his children directly, so they were living with neighbors. And then when he died, they were then adopted by their uncle and their mother's brother, John Diamond, who became their legal guardian. And then a number of years later, both Joseph and Mary Ann stayed in the area, and in 1839, the brother and his little sister had a double wedding. He married Caroline Holly, and Mary Ann married Hezekiah Rowley. So the Rowleys, both of them, Mary Ann and Hezekiah, are both also buried in Greenwood. If you should go to Greenwood and walk around, you may find the Rowleys. And then Joseph, the older brother, his daughter Mary became very active in Birmingham in the suffrage movement toward the end of the 19th century and early 20th century. She was quite the interesting person. She never married. She got into politics. She traveled to Cuba. She was really something. So that's what happened to Mary Ann and Joseph. Another little girl in the area at the time was Fanny Fish. She was the daughter of Elijah Fish. So this occurred. Emery was her uncle. She was a little bit older than Mary Ann Utter, and she recorded her memory of the events in 1888. And she didn't add anything, that I didn't already include in the description. She grew up in Birmingham. She remained unmarried for many, many years. She went to California. She was pretty interesting. She was an amateur botanist who discovered some plants and that were named after her. Then she later returned to Birmingham and married Hugh Irving, another local well-known man, after the Civil War. And then after he died, when she was way in advanced age, she married her childhood sweetheart, Albert Trollope, and they lived happily together for several years before they both died. So that concludes our presentation, but we still have a little bit of time for any other comments or questions, either in the audience or in the chat. So I see an audience person.
Was Deacon Fish an ordained deacon, or did he just become a deacon?
The question is, was Deacon Fish an ordained deacon, or did he just become a deacon? And I don't know the answer to that.
Because in those days, a lot of people, they called themselves doctors without actually going to medical school.
Right.
Things were a lot different.
Right. So I don't know the answer. I do know, though, that the Presbyterian Church was very successful. He was one of the founders, and it went on to grow. And it's I think it's considered the first Presbyterian church in Birmingham now.
Also, when I was getting my degree, we were told that the Indians did not start the scalp. That originally the white settlers started scalping and blamed it on the Indians.
Okay, so the question is about scalping and whether white settlers started that practice and then Native people borrowed it. I think that did happen sometimes, but the cultural meaning of counting coup was something that was part of the warrior culture of the indigenous peoples, if they were warrior peoples. Not every tribal group was warlike. So I don't think I could lay the blame all on white people doing it, but I will say that the British did pay the Native people for American scalps. So they were being paid to take American scalps. So, that's an incentive. Any other chat questions or comments? Okay, and I'm going to turn it over for one final opportunity to Commander Grewe if he wants to wrap anything up or say anything else, and then we'll conclude.
Well, I just want to say thank you to Leslie. This is the second time she's invited me out to be part of this presentation. She really does all the work in this and puts the slides together and has all the information. So I'm along for the ride, and she does a great job and presents this information, I think, very well in a very detailed manner. So I enjoyed being part of this both last time and this time. So thank you for that. I really don't have much more to add to the story here. I just want to say again, that mental health in today's world is something that we take very serious here at the Birmingham Police Department. We are part of a core program. What is a core response? We do have on staff a social worker that is employed through the Oakland County Health Network. It's part of a mutual aid agreement with us, Bloomfield Township, and Auburn Hills Police Department. And that person has only been with us for a short time now and has been involved in a lot of cases already and has been extremely successful. So it is something we do take serious. You can see that had a big impact in this case here and a big impact on the Utter family. So that is something that we do at the police department. If you ever have any questions for me, please reach out. I'm always happy to talk to our residents or anybody else on any questions about Birmingham or even this case. If you have any discussion you'd like to have after the fact, please reach out. I'm happy to speak with you. So thank you very much.
I just wanted to point out that, that it won't show exactly. This is the flyer that we prepared for. This is the first of 3 monthly adult lecture series that we're going to give the museum in sponsorship with the library. The next one, if you're interested in the Native American population of the Great Lakes and this area, I'm going to be presenting again on November 4th, which is a Thursday, on the Saginaw Trail in Oakland County's indigenous people. So the point of that presentation is to highlight it's because November is, what's the official term for it? Native American Heritage Month is what they're calling it, or Indigenous Peoples Month is sort of a shorthand version for that. So in that talk, I'm going to talk about some individual Native people who were recorded and their life stories were accounted by some of the early pioneer settlers. I've got some great stories that I think if you're interested in the local people who occupied this area before white settlement, I can give you some feedback on that and tell you what happened to the people who used to occupy this area. So that's November 4th. If you want to come by or catch us on Zoom, see you then. Thank you, everybody. Goodbye.
What is the third episode? You said it was a big part. This is the first part. It's November. What's in December?
Oh, I'm sorry. I was just asked what's in December, but I won't close yet. December 2nd is completely different. Christmas in Birmingham. So instead of talking about murders or the sad tragedy of Native American people here, we're going to talk about how did people in early Birmingham celebrate Christmas. It isn't what you think. So that's Donna Casaselli is going to present that. All right, everybody. So for now, we're going to sign off and see you next time. Bye-bye.
Thank you guys for coming and working.
I'm still in.